Vamos lá começar essa mesa, que é uma mesa extremamente interessante do ponto de vista daquilo que eu falei mais cedo, como devemos nos ocupar do futuro. Eu falei no início dessa conferência. E como nos ocuparmos do futuro passam também por leituras inovadoras. Quando nós discutimos biodiversidade, quando nós discutimos climate change, quando nós discutimos recursos naturais, o uso eficiente de recursos naturais, as perspectivas econômicas, e quando nós refletimos do ponto de vista de o que precisa ser elaborado, formulado, discutido e oferecido para que os governos possam evoluir nos seus processos de debate e de tomada de decisão. O objetivo dessa mesa é exatamente trazer um olhar novo, em cima de novos dados, e por isso nós vamos ter o professor Paul Enkins, que vai nos fazer uma apresentação em cerca de 25 minutos a respeito de um novo estudo que vai ser lançado pelo painel internacional de recursos naturais, International Resource Panel, na próxima Assembleia Geral de Meio Ambiente das Nações Unidas, em Nairobi, em fevereiro do próximo ano. E nós vamos ter um spoiler, se eu posso usar essa expressão, do Global Resource Outlook, que é realmente é o maior banco de dados, a maior visão do mundo de o que está acontecendo nos recursos naturais no mundo. Tá? Depois disso, o Paul vai fazer... Eu já conheço a apresentação, é muito legal, é muito interessante. Eu não estou falando isso porque ele está aqui ao meu lado, mas é porque é provocativa, é uma análise econômica e entra no setor de minerais, entra na questão de mineração, entra na questão do debate de minerais estratégicos, enfim, a questão da descarbonização, as rotas de descarbonização do mundo e a importância desse setor vir e dos setores de uso, que os usuários de recursos naturais terem uma outra percepção sobre o papel da eficiência do uso dos recursos naturais, não só na economia circular, mas também nas estratégias de mitigação em relação à questão climática, de conter a perda da biodiversidade e de conter a crise hídrica. Cerca de 90% da perda da biodiversidade no mundo e da perda de água estão associados à questão de uso ineficiente de recursos naturais. Em termos de mitigação de emissões de gases de efeito estufa, em torno de 56%. Então, nós trabalhamos no International Resource Panel, eu tenho a honra de ser co-presidente desse painel científico das Nações Unidas, juntos com Yanis Potocnik, que foi comissário europeu de meio ambiente, meu querido amigo, e nós estamos lá trazendo o painel científico numa perspectiva de dialogar politicamente e com business, com o setor de business, numa interlocução econômica, interlocução social, trazendo uma nova visão de ciência com policymakers e business leaders, com formuladores de políticas e líderes do setor de negócio. Por quê? Porque nós temos que usar linguagens distintas para mobilização e para convergência, e isso significa dizer um painel científico das Nações Unidas, que tem 3 na área ambiental, o IPCC, que vocês conhecem, o da biodiversidade, que vocês também conhecem, o IPBS, e o International Resource Panel, que tem um caráter mais independente, nós não estamos ligados a nenhuma convenção, mas traz, sim, naquilo que é o título dessa conferência, essas novas economias, como é que o mundo vai lidar com essa relação de crescer, tendo a natureza como um parceiro, uma associada, e não agir contra a natureza. É um outro tipo de perspectiva, uma outra ação, e, obviamente, isso vai direto no pensamento econômico, vai direto na maneira de como nós temos que relacionar economicamente o que precisa mudar e como mudar. Não é só o que precisa mudar, como mudar. Eu acho que isso é uma mensagem extremamente importante. As pessoas nunca viram carbono, as pessoas veem paisagem, não veem biodiversidade, né? Veem as espécies, etc., mas as pessoas veem recursos naturais. E é importante as pessoas entenderem como que a eficiência, a questão da transição industrial, da transição climática, de lidar com a biodiversidade, traz uma perspectiva inovadora, tem que trazer uma perspectiva inovadora, 30 anos depois, quando o mundo tomou a decisão de que nós tínhamos que prestar atenção nisso. Então, é uma nova perspectiva, um novo desenho, e esse é o convite, a alegria de eu ter nesse painel, não só o professor Paul Enkins, tá? Mas também o nosso querido amigo, meu professor Pavan, tá? Diretor executivo da Guia Impacto, mas que foi um homem que no século passado, eu vou falar assim, fez o desafio do TIB de valoração econômica dos ativos da biodiversidade no mundo. Isso mudou a lógica da Convenção de Diversidade Biológica, isso mudou a lógica de negociações e a abordagem de lidar, de olhar a natureza, né? Hoje ele vai nos trazer A ideia é que o Paul apresente essa visão, depois o Pavan entre nessa perspectiva da bioage, da era biológica, a emergência, o que vem, as metas. Não vou dar spoiler aqui, porque é muito fascinante. E aí eu vou pedir meus outros dois grandes amigos. Eu adoro isso porque só tem amigo, então é muito legal. Mas eu vou pedir o Emmanuel da Fundação Europeia de Clima, para fazer uma análise, tá, Emmanuel? Eu quero que você trabalhou com a presidência francesa do Acordo de Paris, você foi uma das pessoas-chave na delegação da França, junto com a embaixadora Tubiana, com o co-chair da conferência, o Fabício, mas mais do que isso, você tem uma compreensão muito grande de como que o Global South vem nesses debates desde Paris. Você tem vindo com a gente, conversando, e conhece muito bem o Brasil, conhece muito bem a conectividade dessas agendas, e conhece muito bem também como mobilizar, por parte de filantropia, de atores não governamentais, think tanks, etc., uma visão inovadora de que nós precisamos ter, e isso ligada à diplomacia. Tá? Então, é importante entender essas conversas, entender como é que essas visões vêm. Eu te vou pedir que você faça uma análise, tá, de fato, do que você está vendo aqui apresentado pelos dois. E depois eu vou deixar a minha querida Ana, da Chatham House, Ana Young, tá, para fazer uma análise, e ela vai fazer comentários, exatamente na perspectiva de think tanks, uma análise sobre o que está colocado aqui. São duas pessoas dialogando com análise, dois apresentadores, e no final eu vou deixar vocês conversando entre vocês. Gostaria que vocês, Pavan, gostaria que você perguntasse para o Paul algo, tá? E o Paul, você vai fundo, vai questionando, pergunta esses meninos para ver como é que a gente faz andar, como é que a gente desdobra aqui parcerias, não só pela questão da mineração, mas pela questão dos setores econômicos e essa visão da questão de recursos naturais, bioage, a nova era biológica, e esse novo engajamento político de sociedade, esse novo diálogo necessário entre setor privado e sociedade, que é importante, além de conversar com os governos, como isso pode se traduzir numa agenda, nas recomendações, na visão, etc., que um país feito o Brasil poderia acolher e ter, nos próximos anos, uma trajetória, não só das suas opções de descarbonização, mas também de voz ativa na mudança da agenda. Então, sejam bem-vindos. Muito obrigada, Pavan. Eu sei que você fez um esforço enorme para estar aqui no Brasil, tá? Por causa dos seus voos, a complicação. A pegada de carbono está enorme, mas depois a gente pode plantar árvore aqui na Amazônia, não tem problema nenhum. Pô, muito obrigada novamente. Eu sei que você também mexeu na sua agenda, um esforço pessoal para estar aqui. Vocês, meninos, adoram vir ao Brasil, então venha sempre, mas eu sei que também a Ana mexeu, todo mundo mexeu na agenda, fazendo questão de estar aqui para também ter essa conversa. Então, sejam bem-vindos. Pô, fique à vontade, fique em pé, como você queira falar. Nós vamos projetar coisas, porque tem números, tem estudos, e depois, Pavan, é com você. Tá bom? Muito obrigada. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Isabella. And thank you to the audience for coming to this session, which is very early morning. I hope you will not be disappointed. This is my subject, and I invite you to a marriage of two very important concepts. The concept of responsible mining, which is at the heart of this conference today, and the concept of sustainable finance. Because without responsible mining, it doesn't matter whether we have sustainable finance, but without sustainable finance, we're much less likely to get responsible mining. As Isabella said, this is a forthcoming report from UNEP's International Resource Panel, should be published in the early months of next year. So I have to ask you please not to cite it, not to take photographs of the slides, because they need to be published and the report is still undergoing external peer review. So thank you for your understanding of that. So we look in particular at critical minerals. Those minerals which we will need in very large quantities for the renewable energy technologies which have to take the place of fossil fuels, which is the number one priority of mitigating climate change. We've looked at the geological availability. I was privileged to share a platform earlier in this conference with someone from the Brazilian Geological Survey, Brazil is very lucky. It has a very strong geological survey, but many countries still do not. But it is clear that we have lots of these minerals, but they're concentrated in certain countries, and we will see that in a subsequent slide. The technologies that will use these minerals require more minerals per vehicle, in the case of batteries for electric vehicles, and per kilowatt hour in the case of replacing fossil fuel power plants than these fossil fuel technologies. And they require much more minerals, so a factor of 4 or 5 in each case. This idea of criticality seeks to capture both the ideas of security of supply and economic importance. It's really only a concept that has been used so far in the European Union, in the UK, in North America, and in China, although obviously the term criticality can mean other things from different country perspectives. One of the challenges of these minerals is that very often they are byproducts or co-products of the production of base or main minerals and metals like iron, like aluminium, etc. And therefore their economics is very strange, because the economics of the main metal is what counts rather than the economics of the co and byproduct. The production of minerals and metals is very concentrated in certain countries, as you will see. And as I've said, there are these enormous projected growths in demand, which at the moment look to be infeasible. So a potential major bottleneck on the road to decarbonization of the global energy system. And of course, as we know, and as we've heard many times in this conference, mining is a potential source of conflicts and an actual source of conflicts. If you look at the Environmental Justice Atlas on the internet, you will find there are over 2,000 current conflicts related to mining because of its local and its impacts on local communities, indigenous communities, and on the environment. And that emphasizes the importance of moving to a much more responsible mining. So these minerals and metals are very different. We talk about critical minerals, but actually each one needs to be looked at in its own right. As annexes to our report, we will publish fact sheets on 2 of these critical minerals, lithium and nickel. Mining is a long-term business. We heard yesterday from a lithium miner who managed to open their lithium mine in Minas Gerais in Brazil in 10 years. That's incredibly quick. The IEA estimates that the average time before opening a new mine from first exploration to production is 17 years. Add 17 to 2023, we're already in 2040, and we're supposed to be completely decarbonized in 2050. So we have no time to waste. Exploration is both risky and expensive. Most exploration comes to nothing, so it's a commitment of several million US dollars for no output at the end of the day. And other sources of risk are obviously to do with policy, to do with governance, and all those kinds of issues. These technologies are changing enormously fast. At the moment, we have lithium-ion batteries, and everyone thinks we will need lots of lithium. But on the horizon is already the next generation of batteries, which may be sodium batteries or other kinds of batteries. And so we have a further risk that no sooner have you opened your lithium mine than actually the lithium is not required in such large quantities. So mining is very risky, and that means from the private sector, it requires high returns. So when you hear that a mining company is making 30% on its investment, that 30% has to cover all the costs of the explorations that came to nothing and overcoming the political and other risks connected with mining. Incredibly important in terms of mineral supply will be recycling and the whole issue of circular economy, but you cannot recycle until you have built up a big stock of the minerals in society already. And for many of these minerals, that will take many years. So although the circular economy approaches are really important, they are not going to replace the need for a very large increase in primary metals. China has been incredibly strategic on this agenda and has invested billions of dollars over at least 2 decades to build up a commanding position in this industry. And I'll show you a slide about that in a minute. It's also invested heavily in the mineral production of other countries. So China is a world leader both in its own mineral production, but also in its processing of other countries' minerals. And of course, that's one of the reasons why people are concentrating now on critical minerals, because they perceive this supply chain dependency to be potentially problematic, especially in the context of the war between Russia and Ukraine, when suddenly, Russia being another very important minerals country, suddenly those supplies are being cut off. Of course, South America is an incredibly important continent for minerals. I've mentioned just 2 there, but there are others. This is the world map that shows where the main concentrations of minerals are. And you see that very long list of mineral concentration where China has 50% or more of global production. South Africa is also important, and then a number of countries in South America. Russia, I've already mentioned. So these minerals are concentrated in particular places. You'll see that Europe is very poorly endowed with these minerals, and opening mines in Europe is also very difficult. So Europe is highly import dependent, and I'll come back to that later. So that's mining. What about finance? This is a little diagram of the financial sector produced by UNEP some time ago. On the left-hand side, you have the public sector, development finance, export credit agencies, climate finance, and in the main part of the figure, you see the private sector with all those various sources of finance. The private sector will have to be centrally involved in the finance of these new minerals, because the public sector simply doesn't have anything like the resources to engage in this. And that means that these minerals will have to command normal rates of return, normal risk-return ratios. Sustainable finance has grown quite fast, and as with all these concepts, it's quite complex. So again, if we start on the left, we have the climate finance for mitigation and adaptation of climate effects. Then we have environmental finance, which looks at other environment-related goals. Then we broaden that to green finance and SDG finance, the finance of that 17 Sustainable Development Goals that Ban Ki-moon talked so eloquently about in the first session of this conference. And then we broaden that further to other social and community issues to get sustainable finance as a topic. Obviously, that means nothing unless we can measure it. That too is complicated, and I think that is going to be a topic that Pavan talks a little bit about when I finished. And we have a whole new industry that is growing up around these ideas of sustainable finance or sustainable development investing, where again we start on the left at the negative side of just screening out certain industries. And it is still the case that mining is often screened out of these funds because it's perceived to be problematic. Then we move to the ESG, trying to incorporate positive criteria of environment and social and governance. Then looking at best-in-class screening, where it's not just ESG, but you try to invest in those companies that have the best of ESG. Or you move across to a sustainability theme, and then you have another subset of impact investing, where the investors actually look at the social and environmental impacts as much as they look at the financial returns. There are lots of different instruments, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because many of you will know it already. But I do want to come to one measurement exercise which, as we were working on this report, seemed very important to us, and that's the Responsible Mining Index produced by the Responsible Mining Foundation. And they evaluated 250 mine sites, so individual mines, across 40 companies, across those 6 criteria or sustainable development themes, so economic development, business conduct, life cycle management, community well-being, working conditions, and environmental responsibility. So that's what they mean and what we mean in this report by responsible mining. A high score against the various indicators that contribute to those themes. There was bad news in that on the right-hand side, the spider diagram, you'll see that no theme across those 250 sites, no theme scored more on average than 30%. And some scored 0. But if we look at the best results for each indicator in each theme, that score went up to between 60 and 80% for these 6 criteria, which shows that responsible mining is possible. The best in class is between 60 and 80%. At the moment, it's performing at below 30%. So there is huge improvement that is required. When I talk to miners, and I've been privileged to talk to a lot of miners in the presentation of this, in the preparation of this report, they always say, well, how much is this going to cost? How much will high ESG performance cost? And I didn't know. So we did a survey to find out. And this is the results of a survey of more than 54 large-scale miners, so not artisanal and small-scale miners, large-scale miners. And we asked them, how much will it cost for you in your business? These are large businesses, so like Vale, like Anglo-American. How much will it cost for you to get high ESG scores? And there's good news and bad news on this slide. The green bars show the percentage of respondents who thought it would cost between 5 and 25% of their current output. So prices would go up by between 5 and 25%. On the right-hand side, the purple bars, they didn't know. They'd never done that calculation. So clearly there's some work to do. And in the middle, you can see the issues, because down the side we've got all the various issues to do with responsible mining that we asked them about. And in the middle, you can see where the companies that thought that this would be expensive. So the conclusion I draw from this slide is that high ESG standards are not phenomenally expensive, but nor are they free. So the conclusions of the report try to bring together these two worlds. The world on the left of mining, with risk disclosure, with due diligence, with responsible markets, the various sets of principles from the OECD, the Meridian principles, which we discuss in the report for artisanal and small-scale mining, and then obviously tailings and mine closure and remediation, a very important part of that process. On the right, we have sustainable finance. We have the various principles, the various frameworks, the taxonomies that many countries have now developed, issues of risk disclosure, also responsible markets, TCFD, TCND, the climate-related disclosures, the nature-related disclosures, the reporting, the metrics, a very, very complex world, and sustainable investing. So our kind of conclusions from the report, we start with the commodity markets that we have, where prices are incredibly volatile. They're subject to enormous speculation on the global markets. And by and large, it's undifferentiated products. A ton of copper sells for a ton of copper, whether it's produced in a responsible way with little environmental impact or produced in an irresponsible way with huge impact on society and the environment. That has to change. For responsible mining, we will need a sustainable development focus, going right back to what Ban Ki-moon was saying about the SDGs. We need site-by-site reporting, community engagement, and community benefit. Turn it up to the... I'm sorry. Okay. I need to speak closer to the microphone. So, community engagement and benefit, tailings management, and there's been enormous progress in that field fairly recently. Mine closure and remediation. We must stop having orphan mines, where the mining company is gone, the mine stays and is potentially toxic to the local community for a very long period. We need to look at the implications of this, what the extra costs of mining in this way are going to be, and who is going to pay them. They clearly need to be paid by consumers, by the importing countries, by the European countries, if we are importing lots of these minerals. That is the most basic economics, that consumers pay the full costs of the production of their products that they consume. And we need to engage with the sustainable finance movement. The ESG assessments, the taxonomies that countries are producing, the need for standardized reporting, for decommodification, whereby every ton of minerals will have its own passport, showing how it has been produced and showing what its ESG scores have been, and the price will reflect that. We need to help companies to transition to responsible mining, and we need to have mandatory public reporting and specific standards. So there's a big agenda here. It needs to relate to the circular economy agenda fundamentally, in order to make sure that once we've dug these minerals out of the ground, we use them for as long and in as productive a fashion as possible. We need extended producer responsibility, and we need to be very careful about this so-called export for recycling, that when we export products at the end of lives, they are properly recycled, rather than the burning of electronic waste on beaches in Africa by children with no protective equipment. There is a huge task to build institutional capacity at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level, And we will be calling for the establishment of an international minerals and metals agency like the International Energy Agency. The International Energy Agency, of course, was founded in the 1970s following the OPEC price shocks. We can't imagine how we would work with energy these days without the IEA, without its expert analysis in a scientific manner. We need the same kind of agency for minerals and metals. And in the long term, I think we will need an international convention on the great resources that will sustain human life if we manage them properly. Minerals and metals, water, forests, and soils. We have the Climate Change Convention, we have the Biodiversity Convention. Each of those has its own scientific panel. We have the International Resource Panel, of which Isabella is a co-chair. We need a convention so that countries can talk about resources in a global forum and work out how they're going to cooperate in the management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Obrigada, desculpe. Ótimo. Oi, vocês estão me ouvindo? Então, sim, olha só. E aqui, tá. Eu acho que foi uma ótima apresentação e uma visão do que, de fato, são questões que as pessoas falam, por exemplo, de ESG, não entendem o financiamento climático, financiamento de mineração, as pessoas não entendem a complexidade do que está por trás disso e as questões que precisam ser resolvidas para que, de fato, a gente possa ter todas as rotas de descarbonização devidamente identificadas com as suas complexidades. Eu acho... Também, ontem nós discutimos aqui no outro painel, com o professor Roberto Schaffer, com a Clarice Lins, etc., com a Ana, com a energia, mostrando a questão energética, a questão dos cenários de 1,5 grau, 2 graus, como o país, o Brasil, tem que fazer coisas completamente diferentes e mostrando também os equívocos já de decisões tomadas, por exemplo, no último governo aqui do Brasil, de compromissos internacionais que não têm, Pavan, os números, fizeram critérios políticos e o país assumiu compromissos que ele não precisava assumir, que não se espera disso, não esperava-se isso dele, e que vai dotar ao país uma complexidade muito maior, com custos muito maiores, para fazer rotas de descarbonização que nós não precisávamos estar envolvidos, exatamente pelo despreparo e pelo aquilo que o Paulo sinalizou, a necessidade de se dialogar com a ciência, com as informações realmente bem instruídas, para facilitar, de fato, tomar as decisões que possam não gerar novos gargalos, mas movimentar numa direção de convergência. É impressionante, o mapa muda quando você olha a dependência e a interdependência de países em relação aos minerais críticos e estratégicos, ou seja, as rotas de descarbonização deverão mudar as relações de poder no mundo, tá? Ou pelo menos de dependência ou de pagamento de custos. Os consumidores vão ter que entender isso. Acho que o Paulo enfatiza isso com muita precisão. Também o fato de que, eu gosto muito dessa sugestão dele, da gente, como se teve a crise de energia e o surgimento da OPEP, para evitar ter uma crise de minerais, além de ser economia circular, o olhar político, a necessidade de organização, de uma melhor organização e de uma organização que nos leve ao entendimento crítico do que significa lidar com mineração sustentável na perspectiva do futuro. Né? E, obviamente, um debate extremamente rico. É óbvio que aqui é uma parte do relatório de recursos naturais, né, como ele mesmo sinalizou, isso é um assunto ainda não publicado, tá? Os números ele não abriu todos, etc., porque estão todos em revisão. Publicar pelas Nações Unidas já tem o rigor da ciência, e publicar nas Nações Unidas é uma ciência ao triplo, porque tem tanta revisões independentes, o painel é muito criterioso, até que a gente tenha a versão final do Global Resource Outlook, que eu já anuncio em fevereiro do ano que vem, vai ser lançado. Vocês são todos convidados, obviamente, inclusive, a acompanhar online, porque vai ser pelas Nações Unidas, e é realmente uma visão impressionante. Nós fizemos o primeiro em 2019, né? E depois isso foi para o G20, para o G7. Tem isso disponível no nosso site. Você tem os fact sheets mostrando o consumo de recursos naturais nos últimos 50 anos no mundo. É muito impressionante. O Brasil, a performance do Brasil, a performance da China, né? Cimento é sempre aquele dado de cimento. Consumo da China de 2011, 2013, cimento é o que os Estados Unidos consumiram no século equivale, no século XX todo. As pessoas não têm dimensão do que está sendo sacado da natureza. Então é importante entender isso. E por essa razão, você foi provocado. O outro lado da história é a história, eu estou conectando aqui com a história da BioAid, e da emergência, e como o Paul falou, como se mede as coisas. Gostaria muito que você nos provocasse, tá? Porque se lá atrás já provocou e mudou a visão das pessoas do mundo para discutir biodiversidade, eu tenho absoluta certeza, e eu sei disso que você está fazendo, como que a gente combina essas inquietações sua e do Paul, intelectuais, científicas, para que a gente possa, de fato, entender que desafio é esse que nós temos pela frente, que eu acho que as pessoas não têm uma completa compreensão, de fato, do que estão dizendo, do que estão falando, do que estão tratando. Mas, por favor, seja muito bem-vindo e, mais uma vez, muito obrigada, tá, por você ter vindo até dar uma esticadinha aqui no Brasil, em Belém, para conversar conosco.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Isabel, for kindly inviting me here, and thank you, Paul, for a wonderful introduction to some of the many themes that I think are rolled up in your session title, which is loosely translated by my bad Portuguese as "The Future of the World Passes Through the Amazon," as I translate it. And indeed it does. But I would say it's not just the future, but it's also the present. And the challenge why we don't realize it's the present is because a lot of what the Amazon delivers today is economically invisible. I still remember many years ago being shown here in Brazil, I think it was by Virgilio Viana, a beautiful simulation of the global rainfall cycle and how most of the evapotranspiration that actually feeds the rainfall, that feeds the agriculture, that feeds the world, comes from evapotranspiration from three massive regions, the Amazonas being the biggest one, and then sub-Saharan Africa, and then the Indonesian archipelago. And you could see these three beating hearts every day, releasing and condensing and releasing and condensing the rainfall, without which actually there would not be 8 billion people, or close to 8 billion people today. So I think there's a lot that needs to be brought out, and I think I like the idea, Paul, that you mooted at the end of your lecture of having a resources convention. There's a lot of logic for this, not least is that this is the entire world of natural capital which is badly accounted or not accounted for. Natural capital is not just the biodiversity, in other words, nature, the biodiversity and the ecosystems of this planet, the living nature, but it's also the dead natural capital, which is minerals, oil, and of course all of the minerals, which including, as you mentioned, the rare earths and the minerals that are needed for the energy transition, which is part of the great transition. So all of this is actually natural capital. Sadly, governments still do not account for mineral taken out of the soil, which should be accounted for as an asset, and only the value addition should be accounted for in GDP as a flow. Governments do not account for it like that. They ignore the stock. They simply count the flow. So the moment that you deplete a mineral resource, there is no reduction in the asset. There is just an increase in the income. This is amazing. If only I could run my business like that, I'd be such a happy man. You know, hey, screw the assets, just get the income in, no problems. Yeah. So there is a lens problem here. There's an accounting problem here, and there's an even bigger accounting problem on the natural capital side, which is living natural capital, because even the flows are not accounted for. So the income that is being generated by the Amazonas today for the whole world, including its rainfall to feed its agriculture to feed us, that is simply not accounted for. And that is part of the lens fix that we require. I speak, Paul, often about the great transition, as I'm sure you do as well. But the great transition is from what UBS, not just me anymore, but UBS, the big Swiss giant bank, calls the impact from the output economy to the impact economy. Now, us economists would understand the output economy as being the neoclassical economy. But that's fine. It's a nice word, the output economy to the impact economy. And the impact economy is different because it accounts for the impact. So not just at the national level, but also at the company level, the private sector level. the impact economy accounts for all of the impacts that a company is having on natural capital of the world, of course on the shareholder capital, but that's already done, on the human capital of its employees and their skills and knowledge and their health, which could be worse or better depending on what kind of policies you have, and on the social capital, which is all of the relationships, the institutions, formal and informal in society, which combine and make all of the other capitals generate incomes, enable an enabling capital, so to speak. And this is the logic that is already there in Professor Partha Dasgupta's Inclusive Wealth Report. He's also one part of your UN colleague network. And that is a very good way of looking at it. And all of this is possible and can be illustrated by how we treat and start accounting for the Amazon rainforest and the Amazon river system. When I hardly mentioned the river system, the physical river system, there is the invisible river system, which is the evapotranspiration, the invisible evapotranspiration from the forest, which is kind of rivers as it goes up the Andes and condenses and forms rainfall and so on. So these are some of the challenges that we face today. But we are not going to get away from these challenges or indeed from be able to optimize and capture the opportunities if we don't talk about them. And I really believe that Brazil, and Isabella has heard me say this before, Brazil is the world's capital of natural capital. This is blindingly obvious in terms of its rainforests, in terms of the Cerrado, in terms of the Pantanal, in terms of the Mata Atlantica, and so on. But it's also becoming more blindingly obvious as a result of its mineral resources, many of which are deeply hidden, and the extraction of which or the use of which is going to be a huge challenge, a huge decision-making challenge, a huge policy challenge, and a huge challenge for the indigenous communities of Brazil as well, in terms of how it affects their livelihood. So these issues are coming to us. Whether we like them or not, these issues are coming. I think it's best if we embrace this complexity and start the work that is required to ensure that natural capital is made as visible as possible, in the incomes that it generates for society, not just within Brazil, but outside Brazil. And that's a big political message that I think you and your colleagues and in President Lula's government will need to start broadcasting as soon as possible, because this broadcast is absolutely necessary. Unless the originator of the income talks about the income, who will? And this income is going to everyone, right? It's feeding the agriculture in my country, in India, among other things, for example, right? So, but we don't know that. I mean, I know it, but we don't know it generally. And that's partly because there's not enough projection happening out of Brazil, which I think needs to start. I'll say a few things about the importance of sustainable finance and what is and isn't accounted for. And Paul, you mentioned the world of impact investing. I call it the II versus II debate. There is one impact investing, which is the $1.1 trillion of very targeted, clean, clear investments, normally small companies, normally startups with very bright, genius level founders, and they're attacking a particular social problem, and they're trying to meanwhile make some money out of it as well, but attacking and solving the social problem, and that's impact investing. And there's about $1.1 trillion worth of those assets, mainly debt, not equity, because the equity has not been priced up at an appropriate level. But I'm more concerned about the other II, which is investment impact, because apart from this 1.1 trillion, which is driving the economy in the right direction, there's another 250 plus trillion, which is driving the economy in the wrong direction. Now just think about it. You have a railway line and you have one massive engine, let's say call it a steam engine, massive, huge, and it has the power of 250 of these tiny little engines which are connected up, trying to pull a train in the opposite direction. Which do you think will happen? The 250 will win or the one will win? So this is the challenge. We need to transition the main system into recognizing impacts and not just say, hey, impact investing will solve it, because it can't solve it. Most of the economy is moving us in the wrong directions, and we need to look at impact investing and as an inspiration, but recognize that investment impact is actually what we need. That means measuring the impacts of portfolios who are asset owners, but also asset managers, measuring the impacts of loan portfolios given by banks, and measuring their impacts on society, in other words, on natural capital, human capital, and social capital. So we are again back to this whole issue of the need for recognizing and accounting for the invisible capitals of this world and then the incomes that they generate. So all this is possible. And it is more possible today than it was. I'm speaking from personal experience. I used to talk about this when I would come and think about, yes, we will try and do this in the future. I'm telling you that it is already possible now because, among others, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and among others, the Government Pension Fund of Japan, GPIF, uses the data on impacts that we calculate for various companies. The total number of companies that my company covers to calculate their natural, human, and social capital impacts is 14,000 companies. This is pretty much every constituent of every major index around the world's markets everywhere in the world. So things have moved on. The transition that we are talking about between the output economy and the impact economy needs to understand what is impact. We need to calculate what is impact. And I'm saying to you that that calculation is available. My company and Y4 and a few others have already provided for free impact factors to those who want to use them. And I encourage people that they should. The challenge of this is inertia. I think people people don't like to change. That's a normal human behavior of inertia, and I think partly there is that problem of overcoming inertia. But as my friend Khalil, who's sitting here, used to say that, well, don't worry, popcorn theory calls it. As soon as one popcorn pops, the others will pop. You just have to wait. Don't be impatient. So I hope you're right, Khalil, and that the popcorn theory generates these movements because we need them in great urgency. The kind of issues that will come out and come up as a result of getting the right metrics are who should be paying the costs, how much are the costs, who should be getting the rewards, how much are the rewards. And again, once again, this is a political discussion as much as it is an economics discussion. And I think it needs to be led by you, Isabella, and by your colleagues in government around this country. Let me close by giving you an example of what is possible if, for example, there were to be a natural resource panel. And I hope that it happens, a natural resource convention. Some of you may have heard that the existence of nodules made of manganese and cobalt on the deep ocean floor as a result of millions and millions of years of accumulation of those minerals forming on is an alternative supply for cobalt and nickel and indeed lithium as well, less so. Now, a few opportunistic companies have taken this opportunity to leverage what is available to them, which is basically the resources available on the ocean floor in the Clarion-Clipperton zone in the Pacific Ocean. This has been done ostensibly legally because it has been approved by the International Seabed Authority, the ISA. If I were to ask people, has anyone heard of the International Seabed Authority? It's a United Nations organization. No, you haven't. I would say majority. You have, yes. If I were to ask people, can you guess where it is? You'd probably guess Geneva or New York. The answer is no. It's in Jamaica. It's in Kingston, actually. So out of sight, out of mind, as they say, and there's a classic example of decisions being made by a club of countries which have interests in metals mining and so on, and an award been given to one company, a Canadian company, of an area which is almost the size of Mongolia, to go ahead and collect from there. I don't think this is the way that governance should happen. And I think the institution that Paul refers to and has floated would be able to spot such misdemeanors much earlier and highlight them and explain also the economic nonsense that this is. Because at the end of the day, even though we know that there are damages from mining, the damages from deep seabed mining are many, many times more. You're collecting nodules which are about potato size, so they're about this big, from the floor. This is not a layer of nickel which is 15 feet or 20 feet deep, which you're typically trying to mine from on land. You're doing this on the assumption, and you talked about the 17-year average horizon for the mine and the risk, the economic risk of mining. Here's a multiplication of that risk, because we don't even know if the current technologies NMC, the lithium nickel manganese cobalt, the lithium NMC technology, or the LFP, the lithium ferrophosphate technologies, are going to be the technologies that drive batteries of the future. You mentioned sodium. I completely agree with you. I think that has a huge potential. Those who are the chemists would probably instantly remember that, if you look down the periodic table, just below lithium is something called sodium, Na, and it's available through sea salt, for God's sakes, and what more do you need? There's no shortage of sodium around this planet. So there's a lot going to change, and yet all this investment, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, are taking place to build fancy machines that can go into the ocean, go down 4 kilometers or 3 kilometers, and collect or pluck these nodules from the ocean floor where they are, destroying with it all of the biodiversity that resides there, on the ostensible excuse that, oh, well, land-based mining is so dangerous, you can't possibly do that. And this is the kind of nonsense, Paul, that your proposed idea would hopefully stem up front, rather than wait for the chaos to happen as it seems to be happening right now. So I thought I'd close with a live example of why we need more governance and better governance in some areas of natural resources, not just living natural resources, but I would say also mineral natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Obrigada. Não, yes. Sim, desculpe. Obrigada, Pavan. Olha que eu conheço, né, as ideias e os debates, e toda vez que eu ouço eu fico fascinada, porque o nome desse painel eu deixei para falar isso depois. De propósito, você mencionou, Paul também indicou isso. O título é muito provocativo, tá? E é um título que fala: o futuro do mundo passa pela Amazônia, né? Todos nós no Brasil estamos começando a acreditar nisso, e devemos acreditar. Acho que vocês absolutamente sinalizaram aquele mapinha do Paul mostrando o Brasil, etc, etc. Mas a complexidade da gente se ocupar do futuro de uma maneira realmente inovadora, com a accountability, com a visão estratégica, entendendo as questões ligadas ao desenvolvimento e instruindo o processo de tomar a decisão, e ele transfere para mim uma responsabilidade que eu posso até ajudar, mas não tenho, viu, Paulo? Mas a visão política das coisas, essa visão precisa mudar no Brasil. Tá? E eu digo isso na perspectiva ambiental, primeira questão, a perspectiva política, a leitura política disso no Brasil precisa mudar. Portanto, a gente precisa de um novo imaginário político. A gente precisa de uma nova discussão num país que detém uma parte da maior floresta tropical do mundo, com ativos ambientais incríveis, mas cuja a discussão, ou a mentalidade, ou a inércia, a visão política é refém de uma inércia política. E é isso que precisa ser provocado, porque nós não estamos falando da discussão da ciência, da informação, do conhecimento, na economia, em tudo, como nós falávamos há 30 anos atrás. Nós estamos falando de uma outra dinâmica para instruir, construir processos de tomada de decisão e, mais do que isso, formulação de grandes acordos. Eu sou uma pessoa que hoje estou completamente convencida que a gente só vai aprimorar a governança, a gente só vai melhorar esses aspectos, somos capazes de fazer grandes acordos. Ou acordamos nos rumos, né? E eu acho que quando o Paul mostra como a visão estratégica da China em relação à questão dos minerais, como é que ela está trabalhando isso, e isso é essencial para a descarbonização do mundo. A gente deveria discutir isso numa outra perspectiva do que a polarização geopolítica que está colocada. Aí eu concordo com o secretário-geral das Nações Unidas quando ele fala que, obviamente, as duas superpotências, Estados Unidos e China, disputam N espaços, tem temas que eles jamais vão ter acordo, acordos são muito sensíveis de acontecerem, temas que eles podem ter acordo, como comércio internacional, compartilhamento de tecnologia, e temas que eles precisam ter acordo, climate change é um deles. Tá? Porque nós estamos discutindo isso numa outra perspectiva. E eu acho que esse olhar político precisa ser contemporâneo no Brasil, para que a gente possa entender que o futuro do mundo passa pela Amazônia. Passa pela Amazônia. Certamente passa, não só pela biodiversidade, pelos recursos minerais, pelas pessoas que moram aqui, pelo esse país que tem paz há mais de 150 anos, mas precisa se entender como que nós vamos desenvolver esse novo momento de imaginário político. E mais do que isso, dotar coisas que o Brasil tem com grande qualidade, como a diplomacia, com novos instrumentos que permitam, sim, o país discutir sobre aquilo e formular e exercer caminhos e mobilizar liderança sobre aquilo que nós detemos como singularidades, aquilo que nós detemos como ativos desse país. O mundo precisa de gente com capacidade de provocar de uma maneira construtiva e não mais de uma maneira reativa. O que nós fizemos aqui com os dois foi exatamente procurar criar um contexto aqui de provocação. Eu, de propósito, pedi ao Paul, conversasse com o Paul, tá? E pedi ao Pavan para falar sobre essa visão, que ele encerra falando de governança, uma visão de biodiversidade, da natureza, etc., e a importância da Amazônia, das florestas tropicais, saindo do imaginário político de muitos que acham que é somente proteção estrito sensu, sem entender os custos disso. E a complexidade quando se fala de financiamento, né? Não só para o setor privado e, portanto, as relações inovadoras que precisam ser desenvolvidas da sociedade com o setor privado e vice-versa, compreender isso, e os desafios, que eu concordo, eu subscrevo totalmente a perspectiva de, eventualmente, no futuro, nós temos que amadurecer a posição de termos uma convenção sobre recursos naturais. Agora nós vamos para o segundo momento do debate, da conversa, que agora vai ser uma conversa. Tá? A ideia é que, Emmanuela, você faça as suas considerações analíticas, tá? E ele é uma delícia, ele é brilhante, tá? Um grande amigo. Eu adoro apostar nas novas gerações, porque eu tenho certeza que eu vou estar no futuro, então eu acho ótimo. E depois a Ana vem também com outras provocações. Eu quero que vocês, em 10 minutos, cada um façam suas provocações, e aí, ou 15 minutos, perguntem para eles, ou vocês perguntem para eles. Eu quero uma conversa aqui de vocês, dos quatro. E aí, so what? Se passa pela Amazônia, que Amazônia é essa que ocupará o futuro do mundo? Tá? E que Brasil é esse que se ocupará do futuro do mundo? Aí sim nós estamos falando de soluções e não mais de tensões e de problemas. Então, Emmanuel, seja super bem-vindo de novo, meu querido. E você, quero suas análises, suas provocações.
Thank you very much, Isabella, and that is also for me a true joy of doing it with you and other Brazilian friends. And thank you very much for setting up our conversation in this way with Paul and Pavan, setting up the scene, because I think this is exactly right. And I think the two issues we've heard just now about natural resources, be they indeed living natural resources and biodiversity in particular, but also minerals that are critical to many things, but in particular the energy transition. They are issues that for the time being are standing on the side of the center of the global conversation and negotiation on climate. And I genuinely do think that they deserve to be brought closer to the center of that conversation if we are to make progress on all of the aspects that we've just talked about. And don't get me wrong, I fully support the idea that was floated by Paul to have a standalone convention, if you will, for those resources and those minerals. But I also happen to think that unless we connect that to the discussion on the climate and energy transition, very quickly we're going to realize that this is part of what is holding us back in making further progress in the climate transition, which is already starting to be the case, I would posit, because yes, the US and Europe are waking up, one might say, 15 or 20 years after China in terms of investing into the mining of those resources and the securitization of those value chains. And at the moment, everybody is throwing very large subsidies into doing this. But if we don't have at least more of a coordinated effort in making sure that those resources are available for the transition where we need it, then I think there is no chance that the transition can happen at the speed at which we need it to happen. And I think this is one of the main challenges that this country, Brazil, and this particular region, because this is where the COP will happen in a bit more than 2 years now, will be facing. Honestly, I think that Brazil is a great country to be addressing those challenges, but I also want to be serious for a moment and be clear that the challenges are immense. And it's easy for all of us to be, you know, almost very pessimistic about the chances of success at the COP in Dubai because of where it is located, and to already look ahead to what could happen 2 years after in Brazil, because, you know, it's a different set of people, different political context, but quite frankly, some of the challenges will be exactly the same. And I think we need to be serious about that if we are to address those challenges. There are things for which it is obvious what COP30 is important, and that is the way Isabella has put it on a different panel yesterday. It's moving from Paris +10 to Paris +20, right? So it's thinking that what will happen at the COP in Belém is countries will have to set the new round of what is one of the key pillars of the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contributions, and set an objective for not just reducing their emissions. I think it's a very narrow way of looking at it, but transforming their economies and transforming their societies for the next 10 years, right? That's the way to talk about it. Otherwise, it talks only to a few geeks in climate negotiations. That's not the point. And that in itself is an immense challenge. But in addition to this, the proof of the pudding, in a way, in Belém is going to be not just setting new objectives to 2035, although that is very important, and that's very important to do it in exactly the way that Roberto Scheffer was talking about yesterday on your panel, Isabella. So walking backwards from the objectives of reaching carbon neutrality as opposed to doing it the other way around. But Belém will also have to accelerate the transition pre-2030, right? Because otherwise we've got no chance of staying to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, or even well below 2 degrees Celsius. And this is, I want to be very clear, where we need not just the seriousness of the effort, but the imagination and the creativity of the effort. Because we've failed to do it in the past, right? People who've been in this negotiation for a while will remember that we already had this conversation about acceleration of the effort pre-2020. And we got bogged down into a debate in between, is that a responsibility more for the global north or the global south, and how do we divide the effort, etc. That's not what we need this time. What we need this time is, I would argue, a laser-focused effort on a few themes or sectors or value chains that can deliver fast results in the next 5 years. it's going to be a matter of a debate, including within Brazilian society, what those initiatives should be. But I think there are some that are already obvious. You will need that to happen into the transformation of food systems. You will need that to happen in the transformation of energy systems. And you will need that to happen on issues related to sustainable finance. And so frankly, I hope people in the audience, but also in Brasilia and Sao Paulo, chiefly are already thinking about the types of initiatives that the business sector in particular in this country and beyond needs to put together so that we complement what can be achieved through the negotiations by what will have to be complemented by efforts indeed by the private sector and by investors in particular. Since you prompted me to say a few words about the Global South, I'll say that for me, it is a big opportunity that for the first time in a very long time, in fact, maybe since the beginning in Rio in 1992, we're going to have a very important COP happening in a country that is not from the global north. So that is not Kyoto, that is not Copenhagen, that is not Paris, that is not London. That's going to be Belém. And so I think it comes with a responsibility indeed to interpret the role of the presidency as being a true, genuine leader of the Global South, because it is part of the job that needs to be done, and I think we saw some of that earlier this month in that very same city in Belém with the cupola, and I hope this is what Brazil, with country here in the region, but also with other basin, in particular Congo and Indonesia, will come forward with a vision of the transformation of their societies that is not just driven by the illusion of carbon markets or offsets, but the reality of what needs to be done on the ground, and including the domestic investment that needs to be put in place so that ultimately it contributes to avoided deforestation. But I also think, and I'll stop there, that at some point Brazil will have not to pivot, but to add a layer to that diplomacy of being a leader of the Global South, which I think we're already seeing at play at the moment. Ultimately, if you want a COP to be a success, and not just one to mobilize your own base domestically, politically in Brazil, or your own base in the Global South, you need to be an honest broker of a compromise with countries from the Global North, including Europe and the US. And this is the type of job that I think will be tough, not just for Brazilian diplomacy and Itamaraty, but for the political system here in Brazil, because you don't win a lot of points domestically by being an honest broker in between the Global South and the Global North these days. But this is, in part, what success depends upon in 2 years from now in Belém. So I'll end there for the first part.
Obrigada, Emmanuel. Eu acho que você traz alguns pontos bem interessantes e também inquietantes. Eu vou falar sobre isso depois em mais detalhes, se tiver tempo. Mas tem uma questão que eu vou para poder ligar com você, Ana. Se espera-se do Brasil muito o papel ou de broker and de bridge. É muito interessante. Um país que pode ser um broker, como, por exemplo, a Unlock Net Zero Package. Quando esse tipo de discussão que nós estamos tendo aqui, mostra a complexidade do que significa os compromissos de net zero. E a discussão de ontem com o Roberto Chatham, nosso painel, mostrou claramente os equívocos de leituras sobre isso. Estamos nos comprometendo sem saber claramente o que se espera, o que nós devemos fazer e erros de escolhas. Quando o Paul traz esse desenho aqui, mostrando a complexidade do financiamento na mineração, o que significa os resultados esperados para ser viável comercialmente 17 anos num ciclo, nós estamos em 2040. As simple as that. É o mundo real. Quando você nos mostra o desafio do accountability, né, como vamos fazer contabilidade, como nós vamos, de fato, ter as métricas, entender a governança, entender o Brasil como país do capital natural e, portanto, ser poderoso na questão de vocalizar e transformar o mundo a partir da sua nova relação com a natureza, não é nada trivial, porque esse país não tem a compreensão disso. As pessoas não têm a compreensão do que significa isso de fato. Você pode ter a percepção política, tá? Você pode ter a intenção política, mas a compreensão, o real entendimento dos desafios que estão colocados sobre a mesa, eu acho que nós falhamos, o mundo falhou, ao traduzir, Emmanuel, tá? Depois do Acordo de Paris, por onde nós iríamos. Tá? E essa é uma reflexão importante para acontecer aqui em Belém, tá? Se nós queremos trilhar Paris mais 20. Então, é extremamente importante falar disso, porque é bom que as pessoas se mobilizem com climate change, etc. Mas elas precisam saber que implementar soluções significa uma repactuação de interesses, de visões e uma nova relação entre dinheiro público e dinheiro privado. E uma transformação do engajamento político para a sociedade. Essa inércia que a gente tem que romper, Pavan, é uma inércia também de vários movimentos sociais, várias mobilizações, tá, que estão corretos enquanto estarem mobilizados, mas não têm toda a clareza do desafio, da importância do seu engajamento para a transformação. E aí você está certo como o Paul. Nós estamos transformando economias. Não é só mitigar, né, reduzir emissões. E talvez o Brasil seja muito ilustrativo disso, porque nós estamos reféns do desmatamento, que é um problema do passado do Brasil. Quando nós fizemos Paris, as emissões de desmatamento no Brasil eram 15% das emissões globais, das emissões do país. Então você conseguia enxergar economicamente do que se tratava. Hoje são 50%. E o mundo olha o Brasil pelo desmatamento e não olha o Brasil pelos desafios que nós temos de equacionar as rotas de desenvolvimento, de economia, de descarbonização e de inclusão social. E é com isso que eu te provoco, Ana. Olhando na perspectiva de um think tank como a Chatham House. Você, brasileira, conhece bem esse país. Como conhece também por dentro da filantropia, conhece as interlocuções, as articulações, os caminhos. E a criticidade, eu estou usando as palavras de propósito, de inclusão da ciência no contexto de grandes acordos e no contexto de implementação de grandes políticas. Os políticos rejeitam muitas vezes a ciência. Se a gente voltar a 5 anos atrás, o relatório do IPCC de 1,5 grau não foi aprovado. Lembra, Manuel? Tá? O IPCC, quando pedia que entrasse para a Conferência de Madrid, acho que era Madrid, não foi rejeitado. Não foi Madrid? Acho que foi Madrid. Chile e Madrid, porque era simplesmente os países não reconheceram isso. Então, é preciso entender por que a sociedade tem baixa tolerância também. A inércia. As pessoas estão esgotadas. Não pode ser uma narrativa de tragédia. Tem, para mim, uma narrativa construtiva, de ser inovadora, criativa, mas as pessoas precisam de educação política para lidar com os desafios que estão postos hoje pela crise climática. E é com isso que eu te provoco, Ana. Olhando a perspectiva da Chatham House, olhando os debates internacionais e nacionais, a provocação de que como a gente pode trazer isso melhor, essas informações, esse mundo político. Porque, essencialmente, nós temos um problema político. Na essência, nós estamos falando de um grande problema político, né? E é por aí que eu acho que a gente tem que também juntar e falar de democracia. Mas é com você, quero suas considerações, suas análises. Depois eu tenho vamos fazer a conversa entre vocês e tem 2 perguntas do público que eu vou provocar para a conversa de vocês. Tá bem? Obrigada. Mais de 2 perguntas, mas eu vou fazendo aqui um somebody love. Vamos embora.
I'm going to speak in English, just because, anyway, today. Because yesterday I was speaking in Portuguese, today I'm going to speak in English. And to start with, thank you so much. Such a joy to be in this panel. Like, this is the high quality conversation that we hold at Chatham House. And I'm so proud that we can have such a high quality conversation here in Brazil, here in Belém. And I know that your fingerprint is everywhere behind this. So, you know, when you invited me and you asked me about thinking like the world, well, the future of the world passed through the Amazon. So, in a way, the conversation that we're having here is what I live through every day, day in and day out, sitting at Chatham House, right? The amount of information that flows and the anxiety that it gives me every day, looking at it and say, what do I do with this information? How do we socialize this information? How do we transform our economic system, our governance system, which can take this information and have agency so that we can do something different instead of zombie walking into this. I think this is where, when, you know, and so I just want to add a little bit more complexity into this big pot of conversation that we're having. So when you talk about Paris plus 20, which takes us to 2035, what are the key trends coming our way in 2035? I want to put it for us to grapple with it together. So one is key demographic shifts, right? We all know about it. We know that the West is getting older. We have a young urban bulge coming in Africa and Southeast Asia. We have huge economic shift coming. So a shrinking middle class in the West. Two-thirds of the middle class in 2035 is going to be in Asia. Sit with that number. What does that mean in terms of consumption of food pattern, in terms of all the fast-moving consumer products? Like, what does that mean? And also, what is the role of Brazil in that? Something else. So another. There is going to be increase, so this is what the trends say, right? Increase in political volatility. We're living this now, it's going to be even more volatile. There is going to be shift in global politics, which we're also seeing, right? From the West to East, and increase of tension between US and China. So all of this we're seeing, and this is just going to magnify. There are going to be changes in international systems, including creation of new ones that we are calling for already, right? Either are these conventions, other kind of conventions, or expansion of BRICS. The international order is shifting. And what I also actually mentioned yesterday, which is the decreasing, the power is going to be more polarized, and it's going to be a weakening of nation state. So the nation state, as we know, post-war, Second World War, that role, that sort of entity of nation state is shifting, and then you're going to have rise of different kind of non-state actors, whether it's multinational companies. Again, we think about all the context of what Pavan and Paul was talking about. So companies and even sort of major cities that has power and of nations, right? Things that we already talked about, right? Before that, more complexity for fun. Possible degradation of social cohesion, democratic systems, right? How we build, how society behave, how we build social norms. Things that we already know, increasing frequency and intensity of shocks, which could be climate, biodiversity driven, or health driven. And the health has two angles, through communicable disease like pandemic, or non-communicable diseases like malnutrition. So Brazil, as a huge food producer, moving into ultra-processed food, 2/3 of the world population today is malnourished. And when I say now malnourished, it's not like they're undernourished, which is part of what Africa and Southeast Asia has. Malnourished as in, I think something like half of the population in the West has obesity problem. So what does that mean in terms of food that we're producing and that we're consuming? Finally, just to add, the disruption, the technological disruption that are coming from forefronts in the area of big data and communication, like social media, nanotechnology, AI, and robotics, and biotechnology. And each one of them today are badly regulated, but when they couple and converge, we actually do not understand what does it mean. We, as a society, we're not even prepared to deal with that. So this is just to say, by the way, and there's also that for those who look into foresights and futures, people doing not so much of a prediction of the future, but just looking at these trends and what does it mean is a group of future practitioners would say that the next generation of innovation and industrial transformation, right now we're living in the AI one, the next one is going to be bio-based. So when Isabella and I talk about the bio-age, that is the coming of the bio-age, which is not only about the bioeconomy that we talk about here in Brazil, but is this deep, complete transformation of the economic system where we will have to move into a decarbonized energy, food, and material system. Not only decarbonized, circular, right? And circular and regenerative. So some of these trends, some of these just for sources. If you want to freak out or have fun, they're from National Intelligence Council, so Trends of the Future from Ipsos Morris, and all of that. So you can stare into the future and think about it. And so what do we do with this? So like where I sit at Chatham House, I think about it all the time. Like, what do we do with this information? And how do we have agency so that we can step into the future, we can walk into the future knowing and making the choices and the priorities that we have to do. And I think there are three things. And actually, by no coincidence, is how I think about, how the Sustainability Accelerator, which is what I run at Chatham House, there are the three objectives that we have. One is to mainstream environment and sustainability into other issues, right? So there is the intersectionality between all these sustainability topics, I'm using as a very, very broad term, with international governance, with international security. So Pavan, you were talking about deep sea mining. It blows my mind. People at Chatham House also talk about space mining. That is out of sight, out of mind, because you don't have community that you have to consult with, right? It is about what is your economic capability to put your, rocket up there. So, I mean, the whole thing about like, let's find, space exploration for human habitation, no, it's for mining. So so how do you mainstream all these conversation into one? And then how do we manage all of that? I think that's one. So climate change and sustainability is not an environmental issue anymore. It's a competitive national interest, and geopolitical problem. Second thing is what I do all the time is bring the future into the present. Like Isabella and I talk a lot about it. Like we stare into the future, we look at all of this, and I get anxious about, so what do we do about it? And we know, as you also said, the present, the future is already here. I mean, William Gibson will say the future is already here. It's badly distributed. And so the question is, how do we enlarge that distribution so that we can step into the future and make informed decision and make, trade-off and dilemma conversations. And finally, talking about enlargement, and to your point about governance, is where also my heart lives, is how do we enlarge the space for knowledge and for decision making, right? Today, and I work in an organization which I find is a privilege to work there because of just the amount of information that comes through. But it's an elite policy making think tank, which bothers me as well, because it is an elite policy making think tank, and the future is about everybody. I think that's one thing. And also I talked about the distribution of power, right? Who else needs to be on the table? And just talk about the who else, the intergenerational fairness is so important, right? I look, and this is including my own country, that we have a leader that is 70, almost 80. And we have that in the US as well, which is, you know, they have a lot of experience. But the decisions they're making today, they're not going to live through those the impact of those decisions. Like, what happens with the next generation who are coming and say, so what is the future that I'm inheriting? Anyway, so I just want to end to say that, well, those are two things. I think as a Brazilian, Brazil, I mean, we talk about this all the time, right? We have such, this is the place that we can surf this wave. And we're one of those very few countries that has all this potential to do this. And we will need the political education that you're talking about, creation of new institutions, investment, understanding the investment system. And there is a role for think tank, right? There is a role for think tank like Chatham House. There's a role for think tanks in Brazil, so that yesterday we were talking about it, so that there's more porosity in terms of knowledge and information flow. And then what Isabella talks about, sort of the think tank as a political actor, so that we can open that and create those spaces for building new institutions and building new governance processes. So one final sentence that I want to leave, and all the Brazilians will understand what I'm saying, is for us to serve this wave and walk into this future with agency. I'm going to say it in Portuguese first. As Brazilians, a gente vai ter que crescer e aparecer. So in English, means that we'll have to grow, show up and grow. So I'm just going to end there.
Super obrigada, Ana. Super legal, né? Eu fico fascinada porque é um país com tantas alternativas, e que, na realidade, eu acho que a nossa sociedade é uma sociedade do bem, uma sociedade construtiva. Nós somos muito criativos nesse país, mas nós precisamos nos conectar com esse mundo contemporâneo. Eu acho que há uma renovação, a necessidade da renovação do debate político e do imaginário político no Brasil sobre esses temas. Você bem colocou que climate change, biodiversidade, são temas que deixaram de ser ambientais. Eles são temas de desenvolvimento, temas de transformação da economia, temas geopolíticos. Ou seja, nós temos outros adultos na sala. Teremos outras pessoas, já temos outras pessoas questionando e entendendo no trabalho que vocês dois apresentaram, vocês quatro colocaram a complexidade do que nós estamos, o que é que se ocupar do futuro. Não é trivial. E eu acho que não é só a inércia, tá, Pavan? Eu acho que existe uma insistência das pessoas não quererem ver, tá, o que está colocado aí. E, por outro lado, aqueles que estão sensibilizados, começam a ser sensibilizados, começam a desenvolver um imaginário como se as soluções viessem, por exemplo, única e exclusivamente de mercado de carbono. Eu acho que esse negócio de mercado de carbono, que é importante, a gente ajudou a colocar isso no texto de Paris, o artigo 6, o Brasil propôs isso, um dos que propôs isso. Mas não é só isso, né? Pelo contrário, né? Você tem que olhar as suas perspectivas estratégicas, a sua visão estratégica, entender o seu papel, o seu lugar nesse desafio de um mundo contemporâneo. E eu acho que está muito distante do dia a dia, não só das pessoas, mas distante das muitas lideranças políticas aqui no mundo. E essa colocação que o Paul nos provoca, mostrando, quando ele traz um setor que todo mundo já começou a falar sobre minerais críticos e estratégicos. na perspectiva da transição energética e não na perspectiva do uso de recursos naturais? Porque tem é muito interessante. Não, a transição energética, quanto é que coloca o SUV, quantidade 4 vezes mais de minerais, tudo isso é real, mas na realidade tem uma discussão que você aponta quanto tempo leva, a pesquisa mineral, depois quanto tempo leva para se transformar no business e ser efetivamente uma alternativa. Que você mostra os mercados e mostra quanto vai custar, quem vai pagar isso. Ninguém está tendo consciência disso. Ninguém discute. E isso é o real engajamento das pessoas. É aí que você consegue engajar as instituições para estarem comprometidas. Elas não podem ser reativas. Elas devem estarem comprometidas e entenderem aquilo que está em Paris, Emmanuel, que nós colocamos lá, acho que é artigo 4, os non-state actors e a corresponsabilidade desses atores. Ou seja, nós estamos pegando as coisas e traduzindo isso muito mal. Né? E eu atribuo isso também à ausência de lideranças. O mundo não tem líderes. Tem líderes pontuais, mas não a capacidade de acreditar. E as tensões entre o norte e o sul são reais em termos de credibilidade, de trust, de confiança. Tá? E é uma simplificação do debate que tudo se trata de dinheiro. Né? Os tais 100 bilhões. Tem 2 fetiches climáticos, eu posso usar essa expressão. O mercado de carbono e os 100 bilhões de dólares. Que todos nós sabemos que não são importantes, não são suficientes. E é um número que nós sabemos lá em Copenhague como é que apareceu. Tá? Então, é óbvio que o debate não pode ser conduzido assim. E é nesse contexto que a gente vai para a parte final aqui da nossa conversa, que eu gostaria que vocês falassem entre vocês, ou se despedissem, fizessem mensagens, ou perguntasse alguma coisa para o Pavan, só para inquietar o Pavan, deixar o Pavan bem nervoso, entendeu? Que é muito difícil, né? Porque ele consegue ser mais zen que você, entendeu? E eu vou provocar aqui com algumas questões que estão vieram da plateia, tá? Não vou colocar todas, fiquem de fundo se vocês quiserem comentar. É a mesma coisa, Ana, se você quiser provocar o Paul, tá? Façam, sim, nós temos aí cerca de 15 minutos para uma conversa entre nós, de vocês, com as seguintes perguntas que eu vou colocar de fundo, vocês podem comentar. Primeiro, qual o impacto da mineração responsável nos preços finais de commodities em percentagem da questão da mineração? Tá? A pobreza é um empecilho para a transição energética? Uma pergunta. É possível relacionar a pobreza com o maior uso de combustível fóssil? Essa é uma discussão. Depois, como garantir, outra pergunta, que os objetivos climáticos estejam enraizados nas prioridades nacionais, aumentar a adesão interna para o desenvolvimento sustentável. Aí é uma preocupação muito de como é que a gente vai rodar aqui no Brasil. Eu gostaria de vocês ouvirem, falarem, etc. Mas mais do que isso, quem quer fazer uma pergunta para quem? Tá? Paul, se você quiser começar a mexer com o Pavan, com o Emmanuel, com a Ana, é com você. Tá? Eu vou fazer depois só closing remarks e eu estou muito feliz com o alto nível das colocações nesse painel. Muito obrigada. Up to you. Pavan, se você quiser perguntar. Tá vendo? Ele é super discreto. Adoro.
You'd like me to go ahead first? Well, thank you very much, colleagues. That was a really, really interesting set of discussions. On the question, I think, from the floor about responsible mining, we need to acknowledge that the mining industry has come a long way. I remember in the 1980s, when I was a much younger and more radical environmentalist, I was almost wholly against the mining industry. I joined an organization called the People Against Rio Tinto Zinc Partisans, which was a real campaigning organization against the company that we now call Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto is far from perfect, and we've seen the disaster in Australia where it blew up a whole lot of Aboriginal sites, but it's a much better company than it was. There's still a huge distance to go, as we've seen from the Responsible Mining Index. Second part of that question was very interesting about fossil fuels. And this is where I ask a question really to Emmanuela and perhaps Isabella. Some of my most important scientific work that was published in 2 papers in Nature in 2015 and 2022 was about the quantity of fossil fuels that must remain in the ground if we are to have any chance of sticking to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And it's about 80% of coal that we know, coal reserves, and between 60 and 70% of oil and gas. That has to stay in the ground. We then compare that with the fact that every oil company in the world, every oil and gas company in the world, both the majors and the national oil companies, have plans to increase their production by between 50 and 100% over the next 10 years. And there is no government in the world, and I think of my own government that has just given out a huge set of new oil and gas licenses. There is no government in the world that is prepared to say to its fossil fuel industry, that's enough. Now we go for low carbon energy sources and not more fossil fuels. So my question, Emmanuela, Isabella, in Belém at the climate conference, when do we really start to address this issue? I don't think we will this year, where the conference is being chaired by a man who also chairs the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, which has plans to increase production from ADNOC by 70%, increase production by about 70% over the next 10 years. So that's a really, really big elephant in the room that we need to address. My second question is to you, Pavan. Part of my research in the UK, I'm a member of our Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, and I'm looking precisely at the natural capital statistics in the UK. How can we make these natural capital and the flows from natural capital visible? And this, of course, is to do with value and valuation. And one of the lovely things in the session that you were speaking in yesterday, Pavan, was from the indigenous woman who challenged the whole question of valuation in this context. And there was a wonderful distinction she made between putting money values on these things, which you and I as economists, we understand, and we understand the importance and the power of that. But reconciling that in some way with the value that we feel in our heart, which defies that sort of valuation, and which probably has more political purchase than these more or less arbitrary numbers that come out of our various economic valuation processes. So 2 rather difficult questions, which I don't think we'll resolve today, but I'd be very interested to know what the panel thinks about them.
Good. I love it when it is a bit difficult, and I'm genuinely interested in Isabella's answer. Let me say a few things about my understanding of the Brazilian context for that question, but let me say more about the global dimension to your question, because I trust Isabella way more on the domestic politics in Brazil than myself. But having spent a full month here discussing those issues, well, first we've got to appreciate that we are in a democracy, and I'm saying that because the trend is somehow going in the other direction in many places around the world, and including in this very region, state of Pará, but also other states of the legal Amazon, and also separately states of the Northeast, there is political support for drilling more oil in the equatorial margin. And I am putting the issue right in the middle of our conversation because this is inevitably going to be one of the flashpoints of the civil society mobilization globally going into COP30, because that is about drilling oil in the mouth of the Amazon River. And I think it's going to be very important for global civil society to understand the domestic politics in Brazil, so that the pressure that is put onto some friends sometimes in governments leads possibly to positive results. We don't know. But I can also see how this is a debate that can reinforce the opposition to this government here. And we must not forget that COP30 is going to be right in between mayoral elections here in Brazil and presidential elections the year after. So COP30 is going to be massively political in Brazil, and we need to find a way of pushing the climate agenda that doesn't simply result into such a big backlash that it makes it inevitable that the far-right anti-democratic side of the country is back to power. Now, it is also very important that we start putting an edge onto the fossil fuel reserves. There needs to be a strategy. I agree with you, and I'm spending my time trying to think about what is a better strategy than, I am sorry, the pointless debate about whether the text of the decision in Sharm el-Sheikh should talk about phasing out or phasing down uninhibited or non-inhibited fossil fuels. This is a debate that we're losing. We're losing, and so I don't like it. I'll put a few thoughts on the table that might not look like a perfect plan, but I think have the potential to get a bit more political traction, which I think is what we need, because victory is a dynamic and we can't simply continue to lose. First, the idea of a moratorium, as opposed to thinking about winning a semantic debate on the long term. It is a tactic that has been used successfully in other issue eras. And this is somehow how the debate has been, well, not won yet, and there is a reversal, but we're further away in the conversation on coal than we are in the debate on oil and gas, let's face it. And the debate on coal was, you know, first stop new before phase out existing. And it was also a lot about the investing in the alternative, so it's the two sides of the scissors that need to cut the fossil fuels. But I'm just putting out there in the middle of our conversation the idea of starting to talk about a moratorium as opposed to having a semantic debate on the long term. And I also think that we need to start talking about the coalition of countries that would come first. And I think you need to have some rich countries into that mix. You can't expect Brazil to be leading a coalition for not exploiting its resources if you don't have some of the rich countries that are part of that initial coalitions. And frankly, if you don't have some of the countries in the Gulf as well. And you can expect to see leadership in Brazil on reaching zero deforestation. I think it's a whole different ballgame to think that Brazil could be a leader in the stop exploiting oil if it is not leading a coalition that includes rich country. The third idea I'll put out there, which I'm sorry to say is a way of putting a bit of an edge in between countries that all claim to be part of the same entity, the Global South, But I think we need to stop having Saudi Arabia saying that it will produce the last barrel of oil on economic grounds because it has the cheapest oil. There is a justice dimension to this as well. And if you're looking at it, I mean, you could argue on political terms, not economic terms, that some countries in Africa should be the ones producing the last barrel of oil, as opposed to Saudi Arabia that has the cheapest. That's a very inconvenient debate within the global south, but I'm sorry, that's also the reality of the situation we're facing.
Obrigada. Por favor, Pavan, eu vou responder, mas como nós não temos muito tempo, tá? Nós temos cerca de menos 5 minutos, foi feita uma pergunta a você, eu estou passando para você, Ana, você vai fazer considerações finais, eu vou encerrar e responderei a pergunta do Paul em complementação ao Emmanuel.
It's easy for me to provide that answer briefly because I've actually written it in the preface to the TEEB reports because that was the question that was prevailing on our minds. Valuation is a human institution. You cannot mandate any particular form of valuation because it's existed as a human institution way before economics existed. And TEEB, the study leader of TEEB, acknowledged that in his own preface to his own studies in 2008. Of course, my daughters haven't read it either, so I don't blame him. I don't blame Paul for not reading it, but it's okay. But that's basically where we're coming from, which is that it's a complex institution, a human institution. It needs to be looked at in context, and the indigenous context is one which is oneness with nature. So there's no need to value. That you can just experience it and recognize that value, and that's it. You don't need to go further. Unfortunately, the whole world is not one indigenous community or many. It's a complex world which consists of different peoples and different economies and different entities. And among the entities, the most difficult one to manage is something which is not even a human. It's called the corporation. It happens to run 2/3 of the economy. In the US, it runs 3/4 of the economy. And as I mentioned yesterday, some wise man once said that a corporation has no soul to damn and no body to kick. And that's part of the problem. When you're trying to deal with a corporation and even humans as CEOs of that, you need to speak their language, and that language happens to be economics. Economics has also become the currency of policy, right, as Isabella would be the first to tell you. But therefore, we have to use economics in the right context, and that context is the corporate context. To allow, coming back to your point, Paul, oil companies to continue to drill as if nothing has changed, as if all efforts, conversations are meaningless, is basically to accept somehow that, you know, there's a disconnect in society. I'm talking about bridging that disconnect and pointing to them that these externalities, which is in the language that you understand, which is economics, have to be quantified and disclosed and action taken against them. And since you, in the case of Exxon, since 1978, knew about and had researched for a good 10 years using measurements around the planet, then you have to be paying for those externalities. What are the externalities? Well, according to the IMF, it's, as of now, $7 trillion per annum. Divide that by the percentage that, let's say, ADNOC delivers or Saudi Aramco delivers, it'll give you the kind of idea as to how much they need to pay. So the $350 billion of profits that these companies have made last year might disappear in a flash if they had to pay their externalities of $7 trillion. So these are useful arguments. They may not be arguments that an indigenous community feels the need for, but when you're dealing with companies and you're dealing with conflict of interest and you're dealing with the CEOs of an oil company capturing presidential of this process, the COP process, then I'm afraid you need to start using somewhat different arguments. They don't listen to matters of the heart.
Anna?
I want to pick up Paul's question about valuation, and sort of end my reflection, sharing this journey with all the you who's sharing this journey. So at the Sustainability Accelerator, we're incubating a project that is trying to reform the financial system in the UK. So this is the level of delusion that I have all the time, right? Like, if I can't change the world before breakfast, what's the point? And actually, there's quite a really interesting debate within the people that we brought together. Some of them are in key stakeholder and agents in the financial system. That not only that we have to unpack the conversation about value, so it's not so the financial valuation and economic valuation is one section, or it's an interpretation of the deeper value systems that we have, right? So like, how do we go into that more conceptual level? But also only about value, it's the risk, because today the financial system and economic system do financial risk assessment through the lenses of uncertainty. And what we know, actually, just based on everything that we talked about, sorry, not only about uncertainty, also about liquidity, is that the future is going to be volatile. And we don't actually, the financial system actually does not know how to deal with volatility. And Paul actually brought that issue as well, in terms of the mining. So I just want to invite, as we sort of think through the collective challenge, is use Donella Meadows' 12 levers of change, right? That has different layers when you think about change, how to classify them and how to understand the real impact of them. And at the bottom, which is the most impactful one, is for us to challenge our paradigm. It's hard. This is the hardest work. But that's actually the real effort where we have to put in, so that we will build those building blocks of the future that we want to live in. And then there is a role for think tanks to sort of shake that discussion and bring it to the front of people's mind. Thank you.
Bom, obrigada, Ana. Nós vamos ter que terminar porque vou montar o palco com o presidente Duque. Mas eu vou fazer um brevíssimo comentário, porque já acabou o tempo. Essa decisão, eu concordo com essa análise, o Brasil... eu não conheço nenhum cenário de transição energética no Brasil que não tem o Brasil vendendo petróleo. Então, parem de comprar petróleo quem está comprando petróleo. É tão simples quanto isso. Nós não temos uma matriz elétrica dependente disso. Então, nós temos uma posição muito confortável. 92% da matriz elétrica brasileira são renováveis. 92%. Nenhum país do mundo tem isso, da magnitude da nossa economia. Terceiro, é uma indústria muito competitiva no Brasil. Petróleo, o Brasil vai precisar de gás, não usa carvão, nosso carvão é muito residual, vai precisar de gás para transição industrial em alguns processos, não para geração de energia. Quarto, como eu disse, é uma indústria muito competitiva e eu acho que essa decisão não é uma decisão de governo, é uma decisão de sociedade. Por isso que esse painel foi muito rico, explicar de fato a complexidade das nossas escolhas, como foi feito agora. O Equador acabou de tomar uma decisão que não teria exploração de petróleo mais na Amazônia, tá? Mas continuará produzindo petróleo. Então é importante entender isso, mas eu acho que é uma decisão da escolha do Brasil, e eu acho que você está certo, Manuel. Em 2025, o Brasil, da sociedade brasileira, estará sob uma grande pressão. Que papel ele quer exercer em relação a isso? Tá? E se nós vamos ser capazes, de fato, de ter os países grandes consumidores de petróleo e de gás e de carvão, inclusive a Europa, que voltou a consumir agora por causa da guerra, qual a posição que eles vão assumir de não comprar ou de não ter novas explorações de petróleo e, com isso, dialogar com as grandes empresas e rever os incentivos que são colocados hoje para a indústria do petróleo. Mas esse é um belo debate, eu espero que a gente consiga construir isso. Eu quero muito agradecer a vocês, estão nos expulsando. Olha, tem um time de serial killers ali, tá vendo? Estão totalmente querendo acabar com o painel. It's over, ok? Mas muito obrigado, acho que foi um grande debate, uma grande contribuição, e até a próxima. Até ano que vem tem mais. Obrigada.